The plain south of Zama Regia, 5 days' march inland from Carthage, is flat, dry, and open. And in October of 202 BC, that flatness was supposed to decide everything. Open ground favors cavalry, and open ground favors elephants. And the general who chose that ground had roughly 80 of them, the largest elephant corps Carthage had ever fielded in a single battle. His name was Hannibal Barca. He had spent 16 years on Italian soil without losing a major battle. He had destroyed one Roman army at the Trebia, another at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae he had encircled and annihilated the largest force Rome had ever assembled, somewhere in the region of 50,000 men killed in a single afternoon. Now he stood on home ground, on terrain he had picked, with a weapon designed to do one specific thing, which was to shatter heavy infantry formations by sheer mass and terror. Across the plain stood a Roman army led by a 33-year-old named Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man who had personally survived Cannae as a teenager and had spent the years since studying exactly how Hannibal won. By sunset, Hannibal's army no longer existed as a fighting force. The ancient accounts describe tens of thousands of Carthaginian dead against Roman losses so small they barely registered, and the war that had consumed the Western Mediterranean for 17 years was over. The strange part is not that Rome won. The strange part is how. The 80 elephants, the weapon the entire battlefield was chosen for, achieved almost nothing, and some of them never reached the Roman line at all. Some of them turned around and charged the wrong army. That was not luck. That was the output of a machine, an infantry system the Romans had been refining for over a century. And at Zama, that machine performed the single most disciplined maneuver in ancient military history. There is also one detail in the oldest surviving account of the battle that most modern retellings quietly skip, and it changes what you think the Roman formation actually looked like. We will get to it. Here is what this episode will cover, in order. First, the machine itself, the manipular legion, a checkerboard of independent infantry blocks, 4,200 foot soldiers and 300 horsemen per legion on paper, and why that checkerboard structure was the only formation in the ancient world that could do what Scipio asked of it. Second, the corridor maneuver, the moment Scipio hollowed out his own army and turned 80 charging elephants into a traffic problem. Third, the sound weapon, the wall of trumpets and horns the Romans raised at the exact moment of the charge, and why noise was arguably as decisive as steel. Fourth, the cavalry trap, how Scipio used Hannibal's own signature move against him, a feint that pulled the Carthaginian horse off the field and brought it back as a hammer against Hannibal's rear. And fifth, Hannibal's own plan, which was far better than the popular retellings admit: 3 separate infantry lines built as a grinding machine of their own, and the single hinge point where it failed. There is also a stone monument still standing in the Tunisian countryside today that may mark the battle itself, and we will end with what it can and cannot tell us. A brief note on where this account comes from. The 2 principal ancient sources for Zama are the Greek historian Polybius, who spoke to men who had served under Scipio, and the Roman historian Livy, writing generations later. They do not always agree, and near the end of this video, we will look at what modern scholarship says about which one to trust. Where they conflict, this episode follows the older account and says so. To understand why Zama unfolded the way it did, you have to go back 17 years, to 218 BC, when Hannibal marched an army out of Spain, over the Alps in autumn snow, and down into northern Italy with a few dozen surviving elephants and a plan to break Rome, not by besieging the city, but by destroying its armies and peeling away its allies. For a while, it worked better than any invasion in Roman memory. At the river Trebia in December of that year, he lured a Roman army across freezing water into a prepared trap and destroyed it. 6 months later, at Lake Trasimene, he hid his entire army in the hills above a fog-covered shoreline road and ambushed a Roman column on the march, killing a consul and some 15,000 men in the water and the mud. And in August of 216 BC, at Cannae, he did the thing that military academies still teach today. He deliberately weakened his own center, let the massive Roman infantry block push into it, folded his veteran African infantry onto the Roman flanks, and sent his cavalry crashing into the Roman rear, closing a pocket around an army of roughly 80,000 men. It was the worst single-day defeat in Roman history. Among the survivors who cut their way out of that pocket was a young officer from one of Rome's great families, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was about 18 years old. Rome did not surrender after Cannae, which is the decision that ultimately decided the war. It refused battle in Italy. It rebuilt, and it sent its armies everywhere Hannibal was not, above all to Spain, where the Carthaginian Empire's silver and manpower came from. And it was in Spain that Scipio, given command in his mid-20s after his father and uncle were both killed there, took Hannibal's own methods, the ambush, the feint, the strike at the enemy's base, and turned them on Carthage. He captured New Carthage, the enemy's Spanish capital, in a single day. He won at Ilipa with a reverse deployment that outflanked a larger army on both wings. By 205 BC, Spain was Roman, and Scipio came home with a proposal the Roman Senate hated, which was to stop chasing Hannibal around Italy and instead invade Africa, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general to defend its own walls. The Senate gave him grudging permission and second-rate troops, including the disgraced survivors of Cannae who had been exiled to Sicily in punishment. Scipio took those men, veterans with 14 years of shame to burn off, and drilled them into the sharpest army Rome had. In 204, he landed in North Africa. He burned 2 Carthaginian camps in a night attack, defeated a relief army at the Great Plains, and won over the Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry was the finest light horse in the world. Carthage did exactly what Scipio predicted. It recalled Hannibal. And in October of 202 BC, the two men who had spent their entire adult lives inside this war finally faced each other on that flat plain near Zama. Everything now came down to whether Hannibal's chosen weapon could break the Roman infantry before Scipio's borrowed cavalry came home. Which brings us to the machine. The Roman manipular legion was not a single block of men. That is the crucial fact, and it is the reason Zama was even winnable. A Greek phalanx, the dominant infantry system of the previous 2 centuries, fought as one continuous wall of pikes, immensely strong from the front and nearly incapable of adjusting once committed. The Romans had abandoned that model over a century before Zama, reorganizing their infantry into maniples, literally handfuls, small tactical blocks of 120 men or so, each with its own standard, its own officers, and its own ability to move independently. A legion of the Middle Republic fielded, on paper, 4,200 infantry and 300 cavalry, and its maniples deployed in 3 successive lines. In front stood the hastily, the youngest men. Behind them, the principes, soldiers in their prime. And in the rear, the triarii, the oldest veterans, kneeling behind their shields with thrusting spears, the final backstop, committed only when everything else had failed. The Romans had a proverb for a desperate situation, that matters had come to the triarii. Here is the detail that makes the system a machine rather than a mob. The maniples of each line did not stand shoulder to shoulder. They deployed with gaps between them, and the maniples of the second line stood behind the gaps of the first, and the third behind the gaps of the second, a checkerboard, what the Romans called a quincunx, after the 5-spot pattern on dice. Those gaps were the system's genius. They let exhausted front line withdraw through the line behind it and be replaced by fresh troops mid-battle, something a phalanx could never do. They let the formation flow around obstacles instead of shattering against them. Each maniple was a cell that could act on its own initiative within the larger organism. Now consider what Scipio saw when his scouts reported 80 elephants forming up across the plain. An elephant charge works on infantry the way a battering ram works on a door, by transferring mass into a rigid target. A phalanx is rigid. It has to be. But a checkerboard is not rigid unless it chooses to be, and Scipio realized his formation contained a capability no one had ever used at this scale. If the maniples of the second and third lines shifted from covering the gaps to standing directly behind the maniples of the first, the checkerboard's diagonal spacing became something else entirely. It became a set of straight, open corridors running from the front of the Roman army all the way through to the back. Lanes, streets, places for 80 terrified, 5-ton animals to go that were not through his men. And the deeper insight was about the animal itself. An elephant is not a machine. It does not want to die on a spear wall. Given a choice between a mass of screaming men and an open, quiet path, a panicked elephant takes the path. Scipio's entire anti-elephant plan amounted to giving Hannibal's weapon a more attractive option than doing its job. He screened the corridors with velites, his light skirmishers, so that from Hannibal's side of the field the Roman line looked conventional, unbroken, a normal target. The lanes would not reveal themselves until the charge was already committed. That is the detail from Polybius that retelling Scip, that the corridors were disguised, filled with light troops under orders to fall back through the lanes or sideways into the maniples the moment the elephants closed. Hannibal launched his elephants at a wall, and the wall opened. But the corridors alone do not explain what happened next, because 3 separate failures converged on those elephants at once, and each one tells you something different about the battle. Take the elephants themselves first. Hannibal had roughly 80, more than Carthage had ever deployed, and that number is precisely the problem. His veteran elephant corps had died years earlier, in the Alps and the Italian campaigns. These 80 were newly captured and hastily trained, and elephant warfare was a discipline that punished haste. A 2019 study of combined arms warfare in the ancient Greek world, examining how the successor kingdoms that inherited Alexander's empire used their elephants, shows how deeply integrated a war elephant had to be. Trained over years to hold formation, to tolerate noise, to work alongside supporting infantry that protected its flanks. Hannibal at Zama had none of that integration. He had 80 green animals sent forward essentially alone, ahead of his line, in a single, unsupported wave. Against a rigid phalanx, even green elephants might have done damage. Against what Scipio had built, they were a liability aimed in the wrong direction. Then came the sound. Polybius records that as the elephants began their charge, the entire Roman army erupted at once, trumpets and horns blowing down the length of the line, thousands of men roaring and hammering weapons against shields. This was not spontaneous. Roman signal instruments, the cornu and the tuba, were command tools, and a synchronized blast across an entire army was a deliberate act. A 2019 study in Greek and Roman musical studies on the war trumpet in ancient thought describes how Greeks and Romans understood massed trumpet sound as an instrument of domination in its own right, a weapon aimed at the mind. At Zama, it was aimed at animal minds, at inexperienced elephants already keyed to panic, and it worked immediately. On the Carthaginian left, a number of the elephants at the western end of the charge turned before contact, wheeled back, and stampeded into Hannibal's own Numidian cavalry, throwing that entire wing into disorder at the exact moment it needed cohesion. That is the resolution of the loop from the top of this episode. The elephants that charged the wrong army were not struck by anything. They were defeated by noise, and their panic tore a hole in Hannibal's cavalry screen before a single Roman horseman had swung a sword. And third, the corridors did their work on the elephants that kept coming. The velites screening the lanes hurled javelins and melted backward, and the elephants, hit from the flanks by missiles and offered open ground straight ahead, followed the path of least resistance down the lanes and out the back of the Roman army, where light troops finished or drove them off. Some maniples took losses where an animal crashed sideways into the ranks, and the fighting in those moments was ugly. But the formation as a whole absorbed 80 elephants the way a grate absorbs floodwater. The weapon Hannibal had chosen the battlefield for was spent inside the first phase of the battle, and part of it had been spent against his own side. What happened after the elephants is the part of Zama that deserves more attention than it gets, because the battle was not over, and for several hours it was genuinely close. The sequence runs in 5 movements, and each one was a decision. The first movement belonged to the Roman cavalry. Scipio's Italian horse under Gaius Laelius held his left, and Massinisa's Numidians, several thousand of the best light cavalry alive, held his right. And together they gave Scipio something no Roman commander facing Hannibal had ever had: a cavalry advantage. The moment the elephant charge collapsed, and with Hannibal's left-wing cavalry already tangled by its own stampeding animals, Laelius and Massinissa charged both Carthaginian wings. Hannibal's horsemen broke and fled the field, and the Roman cavalry galloped off in pursuit, vanishing over the horizon. The second movement is where you have to give Hannibal his due, because there is a strong case, made in the ancient accounts themselves, that this was exactly what he intended. His cavalry was outnumbered and outclassed, so he may well have ordered it to flee deliberately, to drag the Roman horse off the battlefield and buy his infantry a pure foot-against-foot fight, which was the only fight he could win. It was Cannae inverted, sacrificing the wings to win in the center, and for a while the field looked the way Hannibal wanted it, 2 infantry masses alone on the plain. The third movement was the grind of the front lines. Hannibal had built his infantry in 3 lines, deliberately echoing the Roman triple line but with a colder logic. His first line was mercenaries, Ligurians, Celts, Balearics, hired professionals. His second was the Carthaginian and Libyan citizen levy, and his third, held far back and under orders not to admit the first 2 lines through, was his own veteran army from Italy, the men of Cannae, 16 years of victories walking. The first 2 lines existed to be spent, to exhaust and blunt the Roman hastati and principes so that fresh veterans could fall on tired men. And the plan half worked. The mercenaries fought hard, then denied retreat through the citizen line behind them, turned and fought their own side in a spasm of rage, and the Roman front pushed through a field that Polybius describes as slick with blood and heaped with bodies, ground so fouled that formations struggled to keep their footing. The fourth movement is the moment the machine showed itself one last time. Scipio, facing Hannibal's untouched veteran line with his own hastati exhausted, did something almost no ancient army could do in mid-battle. He called a halt. Trumpets sounded, the line stood off, the wounded were carried back, and the maniples redeployed. He pulled his principes and triarii out of their supporting positions and swung them outward, extending his front into a single long line to match and overlap the Carthaginian veterans. It was a parade ground maneuver executed in the middle of a battle, on bloody ground, by an army that had already been fighting for hours, and only the manipular system, small independent blocks answering to their own standards, made it possible. Then the 2 lines of veterans, Scipio's Cannae survivors against the very army that had beaten them 16 years earlier, closed with each other, and by the ancient descriptions they fought dead even, gladius against gladius, neither line breaking, which set up the 5th movement, the only one that could end it. Laelius and Massinissa, returning from their pursuit at what Polybius calls the decisive moment, struck Hannibal's veterans from behind. Pinned front and rear, the last army of Carthage was destroyed where it stood. The ancient accounts put Carthaginian losses at around 20,000 killed and a similar number captured, against perhaps 1,500 Roman dead. Hannibal himself cut his way out with a handful of riders, rode for Carthage, and told its Senate to make peace, because the war was lost. Before we leave the battlefield, one question worth sitting with, because it is the question serious historians actually argue about. How much of this account can we trust? Nearly everything we know about Zama descends from Polybius, who wrote within living memory and knew Scipio's family personally, and from Livy, who wrote a century and a half later and leaned heavily on Polybius. That closeness cuts both ways. A 2018 study of the narrative strategies and historical methods of Polybius and Livy makes clear that both men were building literary narratives as well as records, shaping their battles for meaning. And a 2013 study in the volume Polybius and His World documents specific places where Livy misunderstood the Greek text he was working from, which is a caution against trusting Livy's additions, including the famous face-to-face parley between Hannibal and Scipio the day before the battle, a scene that may be true and may be theater. Even the location is not certain. Out in the Tunisian countryside stands a massive stone monument called Checkerboard, and a 2005 analysis of that monument examined its possible connection to the battle fought between Hannibal and Scipio in 202 BC, a monument that may commemorate the victory within sight of the ground itself. May. The corridors, the trumpets, the halt and redeployment, these are as well attested as anything in ancient military history, but Zama reminds you that the ancient past is a reconstruction, assembled from partisan witnesses and stones in a field. The consequences, at least, are not in doubt. Carthage accepted terms that ended it as a military power. Its fleet burned in the harbor. Its right to wage war surrendered. Its treasury bled by indemnity for 50 years. Rome, which before this war had been an Italian power, emerged as the master of the Western Mediterranean, and everything that follows in Roman history, the conquest of Greece, of Gaul, the empire itself, runs through the plain at Zama. Scipio took the name Africanus, the first Roman ever surnamed for the land he conquered. Hannibal governed Carthage well for a time, was hounded into exile by Roman suspicion, and died by his own hand years later in a foreign court. Still, the one man Rome had never stopped fearing. If you take one idea from this episode, take this one. Zama was not won by a hero or a stroke of luck. It was won by a system, a formation of small, disciplined, independent parts that could open into corridors under an elephant charge, halt and reform on blood-soaked ground, and extend its line in the middle of a battle. And by a commander who understood that the best answer to a terrifying weapon is not to stand against it, but to give it somewhere else to go. 80 elephants, 16 years of Hannibal's genius, and the last army of Carthage. All of it broken in an afternoon by men in blocks of 120 who knew exactly where to stand. If this kind of deep look at how battles were actually won is what you came for, subscribe to the War Room Files and leave a like so the next story finds you. There are more machines, more traps, and more impossible afternoons in the archive, and the next one is already being drawn up.